Focus on this grainy image, captured at 5:35 p.m. on October 26, 2004. The man holding the handgun, his face a roadmap of sleepless nights and bottomless grief, is Mark Reinhardt, a 48-year-old engine machinist who, until a year ago, had never even held a gun. The younger man, hands raised in a gesture of panicked surrender, is 29-year-old Jason Miller, a successful architect. These two men were strangers until a rainy night the previous November, when Jason Miller, with a blood alcohol level twice the legal limit, drove his luxury sedan through a red light. In that instant, he ended the life of Mark's only child, 8-year-old David. The legal system had already delivered its verdict on that crime. Now, on this perfectly manicured driveway in the suburbs of Columbus, Ohio, Mark Reinhardt had decided to deliver his. The confrontation didn't start with shouting. It started with a terrifying quiet. For a full minute, Mark just stood there, the gun held steady, his eyes locked on Jason's. He wanted the man who killed his son to feel the one thing he hadn't shown in court: fear. Jason's voice, when it finally came, was a trembling whisper. "Mr. Reinhardt, please, we can talk about this. I think about what happened every single day of my life." Mark's reply was flat, devoid of the rage that was boiling inside him. "You think about it. That's the difference, Jason. You get to think about it. David doesn't get to do anything." To understand how a law-abiding father ended up on this path, you have to rewind 6 months to the Franklin County Courthouse, a place that promised justice but delivered only insult. Mark sat alone on a hard wooden bench every day of the trial. He watched as Jason Miller, dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than Mark's car, was flanked by a team of 3 high-powered attorneys. They painted a picture of a good young man, a pillar of his community, who had made a single tragic mistake. They used words like unfortunate and miscalculation. They never used the word killed. Mark's son was referred to as the decedent. Mark listened as his own life was picked apart. The lawyers implied that David had been out too late, that maybe he hadn't looked both ways, as if an 8-year-old boy on a sidewalk was somehow responsible for being hit by a man driving 60 miles per hour in a 35 zone. He watched the jury, their faces softening as Jason's attorney spoke of his client's charity work and his bright future. Mark saw the system at work, a system that felt like it was built by the wealthy, for the wealthy. And then came the verdict: guilty of vehicular manslaughter. It sounded serious, but the sentence was a mockery. 5 years of probation, a 2-year license suspension, and a $10,000 fine. Jason Miller would never spend a single night in jail for taking his son's life. Mark remembered the sound that filled the courtroom in that moment. It wasn't the bang of the judge's gavel. It was the soft, relieved sobs of Jason Miller's parents in the row behind him. They reached forward and squeezed their son's shoulders. A family, whole and relieved. In that moment, something inside Mark snapped. The grief that had hollowed him out for months began to harden into something else. It was a cold, clear certainty. The law had failed. Justice was just a word for people who could afford it. He stood up and walked out of the courtroom without looking back, the sound of that family's relief echoing in his ears. Back on the driveway, every one of those memories fueled a tremor of rage in his hand. "Your lawyer said you deserved a second chance," Mark said, his voice barely a whisper. "What about David's chance? He was going to be a scientist. He had a telescope and a book of stars. He wanted to see them up close." He took a step forward, the gun unwavering. "You took that. Your money took that. Your lawyers and that judge, they all decided his life was worth a fine." Jason shook his head frantically, his face pale. "That's not what happened. It wasn't that simple. I know what it looked like in court, but it wasn't the whole story. There are things you don't know, things my lawyers, they wouldn't let me say." A bitter, humorless laugh escaped Mark's lips. "What, Jason? What could you possibly say that would matter? That the whiskey poured itself down your throat? That your BMW drove itself?" Jason's eyes were wide with a desperation that looked, for the first time, like something more than just fear for his own life. It looked like a man drowning in a truth he was never allowed to tell. "No," Jason said, his voice cracking. "The night of the accident, we were robbed. 2 men broke into our house. They hurt my wife.
I wasn't just driving drunk, I was terrified. I was trying to get her to the hospital. It doesn't excuse it, I know, but I wasn't some careless kid out partying. I was running from something." The words hit Mark like a physical blow, a story so completely out of left field that for a moment the world tilted on its axis. His first instinct, the one born from months of simmering hatred, was simple. It was a lie. It had to be a lie. It was another trick, another calculated excuse from a man who had used his wealth and privilege to manipulate the truth from the very beginning. This was just one more desperate, pathetic story to save his own skin. He tightened his grip on the gun, the cold metal a reassuring anchor in his disbelief. "You're a liar," Mark said, the words coming out as a low growl. "You had a year to tell this story. You had a whole trial. Why now? Why here, with a gun in your face?" Jason didn't flinch. The desperation in his eyes was so raw, so potent that it felt like something more than a performance. "Because they wouldn't let me," he pleaded, his voice rising. "My lawyers, they said it would muddy the waters. They said a jury would just see a drunk driver trying to make an excuse. They said the home invasion was a separate crime, and our best bet was to focus on my character, my remorse. They told me to keep it simple, to be the repentant man who made a terrible mistake. They said bringing it up would make me look less sympathetic, not more." He was talking fast now, the words tumbling out as if a dam had broken. "There were two of them. They came in through the back. They had masks on. They hit my wife, Sarah. She fell and hit her head on the corner of the coffee table. There was so much blood, they took our wallets, her jewelry, our phones. They cut the landline. When they left, she was barely conscious. I didn't know what to do. The hospital was 10 minutes away. I put her in the car and I drove. I wasn't thinking about traffic lights. I wasn't thinking about anything except the blood on her face and the sound she was making." For the first time, Mark's absolute certainty began to crack. The story was detailed. It was specific. The detail about the lawyers, about the strategy of keeping the narrative simple for a jury, it had the sickening ring of truth. He had seen firsthand how the legal system wasn't about truth, it was about stories. His story was about a grieving father. Jason's story was about a remorseful man. And the better, more expensive story had won. What if Jason had another story, a messier, more complicated one that he was told to keep hidden? Mark's mind, the mind of a machinist who saw the world in terms of logic and mechanics, began to process the new data. The rage that had been a clean, pure flame was now being choked by smoke. The simple equation of his grief, arrogant rich kid plus alcohol equals dead son, was suddenly cluttered with new variables. Panic, fear, a wife bleeding in the passenger seat.
He remembered a day years ago when David was 4. They were at a crowded state fair, and Mark had turned away for just a second to buy a lemonade. When he turned back, David was gone. The next 3 minutes of his life were a blur of pure animal panic. He remembered the cool dread that flooded his veins, the way his brain shut down all rational thought. He didn't think, he just moved, shouting his son's name, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. A security guard had found David a few aisles over, staring at a display of prize-winning pumpkins, completely unaware of the terror he had caused. But Mark never forgot that feeling, that complete loss of control where the world narrows to a single desperate objective. He hated himself for it, but in that moment, standing on Jason Miller's driveway, he could almost understand the state of mind Jason was describing. The gun in his hand, which had felt so righteous and powerful just minutes before, suddenly felt heavy. It felt like a stupid, brutal piece of metal, a blunt instrument in a situation that had just become terrifyingly complex. He looked at his own hands, calloused and capable, hands that had built David's first bicycle and held him when he was sick. They were not the hands of a killer. Or were they? He had been so sure. He had spent the last 6 months building a case in his own mind, stacking up every injustice, every dismissive glance from Jason's lawyers, every cold legalistic word in the court documents. He had built a fortress of certainty around his anger, and now, with a few desperate sentences, Jason Miller had found a crack in the foundation. Mark looked at Jason's face, really looked at it, searching for the smirk of a liar, the flicker of deception in his eyes. He found nothing. All he saw was a man who looked haunted. It was a different kind of pain than his own, but it was there. It was the agony of a man trapped by a cascading series of terrible decisions, a man whose worst moment was far more complicated than anyone knew. The power dynamic on the driveway had shifted. Mark had come here as the executioner, the final arbiter of a justice that had been denied. Now he was just a man holding a gun, his moral clarity shattered. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. The only sound was the rustling of leaves in the autumn breeze. Mark, slowly, almost imperceptibly, lowered the gun by a single inch. His voice, when he spoke, was no longer the voice of an avenger. It was the voice of a man lost in the wreckage. "If it's true, why didn't you try to find me? Why didn't you ever try to explain?" Before Jason could answer, the lock on the front door of the house made a soft clicking sound. It began to swing open.
The sight of the opening door sent a jolt of adrenaline through both men. It was a sudden intrusion of the normal world into their suspended, violent reality. For Mark, the thought of a witness, of this private reckoning and becoming a public spectacle was horrifying. For Jason, his face contorted in a new kind of panic, a fear not for himself, but for who was behind that door. A woman appeared in the doorway, her hand shielding her eyes from the late afternoon sun. She was slender, with dark hair pulled back from a face that was etched with worry. This was Sarah Miller. Mark recognized her instantly from the trial. She had sat behind her husband every day, a silent, elegant figure of support. But the woman in the doorway looked different. The polished composure she had maintained in the courtroom was gone. Now she just looked terrified. She took in the scene on her driveway, the strange man, the gun in his hand, the frozen terror on her husband's face, and a small, strangled gasp escaped her lips. Hiding behind her, clutching the back of her jeans, was a small boy. He had a mop of sandy blonde hair and big, curious brown eyes. He was small for his age, with the same lanky build David had. He looked to be no older than 8. The sight of the boy was a gut punch. It was like seeing a ghost. For a year, Mark had meticulously dehumanized Jason Miller. He was a monster, a symbol, a faceless villain in the story of his own grief. He never allowed himself to think about Jason's life, his home, his job. And he certainly never, ever allowed himself to imagine that Jason Miller had a family, that he had a son. The boy, unaware of the life and death tension in the air, peeked out from behind his mother, his eyes, wide and innocent, fixed on Mark. In that moment, the entire narrative of Mark's anger collapsed. The man he was about to kill wasn't just a drunk driver. He was a father, and Mark was about to do to this little boy exactly what had been done to him. He was about to create another grieving family, another empty bedroom, another future stolen. The fortress of his certainty, already cracked, crumbled into dust. The gun in his hand now felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds.
His mission of righteous vengeance was suddenly exposed for what it truly was, a selfish, destructive act that would only multiply the pain, not erase it. "Jason, what's going on?" Sarah's voice was a shaky whisper. "Who is this?" Jason, seeing his terrified family, took a hesitant step forward, his hand still raised. His focus was entirely on Mark, his eyes pleading, begging for a different outcome. "Sarah, take him back inside," he said, his voice strained. "Just go back inside and lock the door, please." Then he turned his gaze back to Mark, and the words he spoke next were not for his wife, but for the man holding the gun. It was a final desperate plea, a plea from one father to another. "Please," he begged, his voice breaking, "whatever you're going to do, don't do it in front of my son. His name—" Jason choked on the word, a wave of realization and horror washing over his face as he understood the cruel cosmic coincidence he was about to unleash. He seemed to know, even before the sound left his lips, that this final detail would change everything. "It's David." The name hit the air and hung there, an impossible, echoing sound. David. Of all the names in the world, it was David. It was a coincidence so monstrous, so statistically improbable, that it felt like a deliberate act of cruelty from the universe itself. Mark's mind went blank. The complex thoughts, the doubt, the flicker of empathy he had just felt, it was all incinerated in an instant. The sound of his son's name coming from this man's mouth was a violation. It was a profanity. It wasn't a coincidence. It was an omen. It was a sign that this was meant to be. The smoke of confusion cleared, and the clean, pure flame of rage returned, hotter and more blinding than before. All the progress he had made, all the cracks in his anger, were sealed shut. This wasn't Jason Miller's son, it was David. A different David, a living David, who would get to grow up, ride a bike, go to college, fall in love. A David who would get to live the life that was stolen from his own son. The sudden violent unfairness of it all was too much to bear. Mark's grief, which had been momentarily complicated by Jason's story, was now simplified back into its most potent form. This was the man who took his David, and this man had a David of his own. The universe, in its infinite cruelty, was showing him exactly what he had lost and what this man still had. The gun, which had felt so heavy, was suddenly light again. His aim, which had wavered, was now rock steady. The world narrowed once more, just as it had in the fairground all those years ago. But this time, his objective wasn't to find his son, it was to avenge him. He looked past Jason, at the little boy with his father's eyes, and for a fleeting, terrible moment, he saw his own son's face. And he knew what he had to do. His voice when he spoke was a single ragged whisper, a question that wasn't really a question at all. "What did you say?" Before Jason could answer, before Sarah could scream, before the little boy could even process what was happening, Mark's finger tightened on the trigger.
A single deafening gunshot tore through the quiet suburban air. The sound was brutally final. For a split second, everything was frozen, a perfect, horrific tableau. Then chaos erupted. Sarah Miller's scream was a raw, primal sound of disbelief and terror. She instinctively grabbed her son, pulling him tight against her and turning his face away from the scene on the driveway, shielding him from a sight that would forever be burned into her own memory. Jason Miller lay on the concrete, his body unnaturally still. A dark stain was already spreading across the front of his shirt. Mark stood over him, the gun still in his hand, his arm locked straight. He wasn't looking at the man he had just shot. He was staring at the boy, the other David. The boy was crying, his small body shaking with sobs, his face buried in his mother's side. He was a mirror image of the grief Mark had felt for a year, a perfect, terrible echo of his own loss. The rage that had propelled him to pull the trigger vanished as quickly as it had come, replaced by a profound, crushing emptiness. There was no satisfaction, no release, no sense of justice. There was just the screaming of a woman, the crying of a child, and the hollow ringing in his ears. He didn't run. The thought never even occurred to him. He lowered the gun, his arm dropping to his side as if the weapon had suddenly become impossibly heavy. He turned and walked slowly to the curb at the end of the driveway, the same spot where his son's school bus used to drop him off. He sat down on the cold concrete, placed the gun on the ground beside him, and waited. He could hear Sarah on the phone inside, her voice a frantic, broken mess as she screamed at a 911 operator. In the distance, the first faint wail of a siren began to cut through the afternoon quiet. He didn't feel like a killer. He didn't feel like a grieving father anymore. He didn't feel like anything. He was just a man sitting on a curb, the architect of a new tragedy, waiting for the consequences he knew he deserved. The police arrived in a storm of flashing red and blue lights. They found him exactly as he was, sitting calmly, his hands empty and visible. He offered no resistance as they shouted commands, as they approached with their own weapons drawn, as they kicked his gun away and wrenched his arms behind his back, the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into his wrists. His first words to the arresting officer were spoken in a voice that was flat and lifeless. His son's name was David, he said, not as an excuse, but as a simple, heartbreaking statement of fact. His son's name was David, too.
The case of Mark Reinhardt captivated the state of Ohio. The first trial had been a quiet affair, a procedural march through the legal system. The second trial was a media circus. The prosecution painted a clear picture of a vengeful man who'd appointed himself judge, jury, and executioner. They presented the timeline of his actions, the gun purchase, the waiting. It was, they argued, a textbook case of first-degree murder. Mark's public defender didn't argue the facts. He couldn't. Instead, he told a story. He told the story of a father broken by loss and then broken again by a justice system that had devalued his son's life. He presented the court records from the first trial, the light sentence, the fine that was less than the cost of Jason Miller's car. He put Mark on the stand, and against his lawyer's advice, Mark told the truth. He spoke of his son, of the gaping hole in his life, of the cold injustice he felt in that courtroom. And then he told them about his final conversation with Jason Miller. He told them about the home invasion, about the flicker of doubt he had felt, and he told them about the final, unbearable trigger. He told me his son's name, Mark said to the silent courtroom, his voice heavy with a sorrow that went beyond his own loss. And in that moment, all I could see was my boy. All I could think was that this man was going to get to watch his David grow up. It wasn't fair. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict that, once again, seemed to satisfy no one. They found him guilty, not of first-degree murder, but of second-degree. They acknowledged the premeditation, but they also acknowledged the extreme emotional disturbance that had driven him. Mark Reinhart was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. He never appealed. The case left behind a legacy of ruin. Two families, linked by a single tragic moment on a rainy night, were both irrevocably destroyed. Sarah Miller sold the house on the quiet suburban street and moved away with her son, trying to escape the ghosts of that afternoon. She changed their last name, hoping to give her David a chance at a life not defined by the violence he had witnessed. And Mark Reinhart sits in a cell at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility. He is a model prisoner. He works in the prison machine shop, his hands which once built engines and held his son, now repairing state equipment. He doesn't speak much about that day. He doesn't have to. He relives it every night in his dreams. There is no simple moral to this story. There are no heroes or villains, only victims. It's a chilling reminder that when the scales of justice feel broken, some men will try to balance them with their own hands. And in the end, the only thing they create is more weight, more sorrow, and a grief that spreads like a poison from one family to the next. If you found this story compelling, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more content that explores the deepest, most complex parts of the human experience.